Hello, this is Professor Lungerhausen, and I have a short lecture on the structure of the Chinese imperial system before 1911. You should feel free to pause the video now, download a copy of the PowerPoint, and print it off if you want to use it to take notes. You'll also want to grab your Miller textbook. I'm going to refer to it briefly in lecture. The Chinese imperial state developed its major structural forms early on with the Qin and later Han dynasties. In the Han Dynasty, the smallest unit of government with a centrally appointed official was called the shan, or county. As you can see here, the number of counties remained fairly consistent over time, with around 1100 and under the Han Dynasty in 80 CE, or the first century of the Common Era, up to the Ming Dynasty in the 16th century and the Qing Dynasty in the 19th century, with each of those having about 1300 shan, or counties. The same was true for the total number of officials. We have pretty good numbers going back to the Tang Dynasty in the 9th century, and there were around 18,000 officials then. About 300 years later, the number had only grown to about 20,000 under the Song Dynasty. And the Song Dynasty is a key period for the development of the Chinese imperial bureaucracy because this was when the examination system was formalized and made the primary method for selecting and promoting scholar officials. Now, if you consider the fact that the population had quadrupled between the Song and the late Qing dynasties, the stability in the number of officials is even more remarkable. There were probably, about 110 million people governed by the Song dynasty in 1100, and then in 1850 there were about 425 million. These numbers are, by the way, tentative because there weren't any official formal censuses done at the imperial level under the Chinese imperial state. The numbers are all extrapolated from local tax rolls and things like that. China wouldn't have its first modern census until 1980. More importantly than just the number of people, the size of the territory administered by the Chinese imperial bureaucracy grew dramatically, especially between the Song dynasty and the Qing dynasty. Here you can see the Song really governs what we'd mainly consider eastern China, and the Qing dynasty, as you recall from the Miller reading, dramatically expanded the borders of the Chinese imperial state to encompass large parts of Central Asia, Mongolia, as well as Tibet and parts of southwestern China. So, even if we took all 20,000 officials and distributed them evenly across the territory of these two empires, it's hard to see how they would have administered the state in the modern sense. In the Song dynasty, you'd end up with, say, roughly one official per 5,500 people. Under the Qing dynasty, there'd be one official per 21,250 people. But this disparity grows even further when you consider the fact that most of the officials were actually either located in Beijing or in one of the provincial capitals, and there was usually only one imperial official to administer each county. So if you take that into account, there was really only one local official per 90,000 people under the Song dynasty, and under the Qing dynasty there was one local official per 312,000 people. And keep in mind that the role of the scholar official was limited to a few key tasks, but still they were significant. The official had to administer the water or public works, that is, they had to oversee the regulation of the rivers and irrigation systems to make sure they worked properly. They served as the judge and prosecutor on behalf of the emperor. They had to collect taxes and in some cases oversee the regulation of trade in some of the marketplaces, usually the main town of the county. Maybe sometimes they'd look into the local villages. But that's an awful lot of territory for one person to cover, especially in some counties that were very, very populous indeed. So, what do these numbers tell us? Well, by modern standards, China was really undergoverned. And that's not surprising. Power was very diffuse in the early modern world. The state did not do a lot by our own standards today. Um, the nature of power was such that the government's writ was strongest in areas around the capital city, Beijing, and in the cities and territories that were more closely tied to Beijing by easy transportation, like, say, coastal shipping, riverways, or in some cases, roads. Once you got out of those major areas, this power of the government was a lot more diffuse. And this brings us back to the Miller book. I think the key paragraph that he gives us on the Chinese state comes on page 27 in the chapter East Asia in 1800. And Miller basically goes through and talks about how while European observers were impressed by the examination system, the structure of the Chinese imperial system, um, but they didn't realize that, to quote Miller directly, China's myriad peasant villagers largely governed themselves under the supervision of the local gentry. That is, most the villagers themselves undertook most of the major tasks of government. They were the ones who provided the labor to build roads or to improve the irrigation works. The village headman was responsible for the collection of taxes. Villagers and their extended families served as uh, the the sort of court of first resort where people tried to resolve their legal disputes and the like, and only later did the gentry or ultimately the scholar official themselves become involved in serious cases. So, as long as the peasants accepted the uh, governance or oversight of the gentry and the scholar officials, they largely governed themselves, and the system worked fairly well. But as Miller points out, once this system comes under stress, uh, there will be significant consequences for the imperial system. Now, with the gentry or literati acting as the informal local government, they're also this is where the Confucian heritage becomes significant. Um, the Confucian classics gave the gentry and scholar bureaucrats a common language and sense of how things should be run, a common frame of reference. Uh, in fact, the scholar officials would basically be drawn from this group of local well-to-do people and landowners. Uh, they would be the only ones who had the time to study the Confucian classics in order to take the exams anyway. So the Confucian heritage becomes a common touchstone for these literate people. Um, it's also important in that this is the reason, this common heritage was the reason they spent so much time on moral improvement for themselves and the peasants. For example, the sacred edict that you read in Barry and the sacred edict lecturing was a way for literate people to distribute these values very widely in a society that was mainly illiterate. The Sacred Edict and Confucianism also legitimated the rule of both the informal government of the gentry and the formal government by the scholar officials and the emperor. Now, to the conclusion. Uh, to sum up, Imperial China's bureaucracy was old, it was large, and it was well established. But it did not change a lot in terms of its size and structure over the centuries. There's a remarkable case of continuity here, especially when you start looking from the Song dynasty onwards. The Chinese imperial system really relied on informal structures and local elites. It wouldn't have functioned very well without them. Um, when these informal structures, and indeed when village cohesion comes under stress and starts to crumble in the late 19th and early 20th century, the Chinese imperial system did not have very many good responses to either domestic unrest by peasants in things like the Taiping Rebellion or the Boxer Rebellion, and they didn't really have really good ways to respond to imperial encroachment by first the British and the French, and then later the Americans and the Japanese. As a result, China's uh, ability to reform and modernize itself, at least under the imperial system, was very limited. And this helps to explain why the break with the Confucian past had to be so total later on.